Hey everyone, it's time for another React lesson. This time we're going to be looking at creating a modal, which traditionally, right, this would largely be a challenge of CSS and then having a button that shows a modal or not. The problem is that when we want things like a modal to position themselves absolutely on our screen, that can get messed up by elements rendered above them. So if you have a container element that has overflow hidden, for example, you can't render a modal underneath it that's going to take up the whole screen because it will overflow that container and then get cut off. So the solution for this in React is a built-in tool that I don't think enough people know about called portals. And what this is React allows us to take any elements we want to render, and instead of putting them where they're supposed to go, we can shove them inside of any other DOM element we want. We can put them anywhere. We can effectively teleport some React elements to a different part of the DOM. And this is really useful for things that need to be rendered independent of any CSS of their containers, like modals or toasts, or even like a sticky header that you need to dynamically put things in and out of, where you don't necessarily want to like raise all your state up so you can render, the header with conditional things in it. And we're going to be exploring that. We're also going to be talking a bit about DOM manipulation. Portals require a little bit of DOM manipulation in order to make DOM elements to put our things inside of, but we're also going to take a look at some of the CSS hurdles of doing a portal correctly, which is going to involve doing some DOM manipulation, which is always fun to do in React, and is one of my favorite interview questions is, when have you had to do DOM manipulation in React? Because there's always an interesting story. We can't forget we're in the browser. Last disclaimer before we dive in and take a look. We are using TypeScript for this. We're going to write types like twice. Right? Last project, pretty TypeScript heavy. This one, almost none, and that's kind of the beauty of TypeScript. So if we take a look inside of app.tsx, we have some stuff started for us. In our app, we have our main container with two buttons that should trigger modals. This one here, which should open a modal, and then this one here, which is inside of a sticky footer, which has got its own absolute positioning and its own overflow hidden. So we wouldn't be able to render a modal as a child of this div. If we take a look at our CSS and look at sticky footer, and it's position fixed, overflow hidden, can't render a modal underneath there. Now I'm going to ask you all a question real fast. Would you rather that we get started by actually just building the CSS of a modal first and seeing why it doesn't work, or would you rather us do the portal bit first?
I'd say CSS, but I by no means care that much.
Well, you answered first, so that's what we're doing. Honestly, that's my preference as well. I just don't know if y'all are itching to get to the slightly more exciting parts, even though I think CSS is great. Okay, so let's get these both back open. So I have these placeholder components, modal, which right now just renders its children inside of a div, right? And so that's what this is a test is rendering inside of. So we're going to need two divs, right? Because in my mind, when I picture a modal, right, I'm picturing a off-white box in the middle of the screen, and then everything else is grayed out around it. So that outside gray is going to be this outer container div, which will fill our page, and then the inner one is going to be our off-white box. So on this outer div, I'm going to go ahead and set a class name using CSS modules, which I like to do. We're going to call this modal container. It's an exciting name. I use the word container way too much when I write CSS. But with modules, no one can stop me. Okay, and I need to set my CSS indent level to 2. which I should do. I just do that every time I launch my editor instead of just setting it once in my config. Okay, so what we're going to do is we're going to set the width of this to 100 VW and the height of it to 100 VH. And on modern browsers, that's just going to make it 100% of the width or height, respectively, of the viewport. Easy way to fill everything up. We're going to position this absolutely, so that way we can specify where we want it. And the way that this works, the way that absolute and relative positioning works, is essentially what's going to happen is our element is going to traverse up the tree to find something that has position relative set on it. And then it's going to use that as the basic set of coordinates for where it should be. So when I say left 0 and top 0, I'm saying I want the top left corner of this to be offset 0 pixels from whatever parent container first has position relative. If it doesn't find that, that's going to default to the body. And that's what we want. That's the whole reason we have to do this is, right, this is going to have position relative or absolute, and it is going to mess up that relative positioning. So that's going to work for this one. So we've got that going. I'm also going to set a background of RGBA, and this is just a little SAS thing. 000 is black and 0.2, so 20% opacity seems reasonable to me. We're also going to do, we'll just call it Modal, which is going to have a background of fa, beautiful off-white. Let's set a border radius on it of 0.25 rem. That seems fancy. And that should hold us for now. So then we'll do a class name, styles.modal. And then we're rendering the children of the modal component, which we can see is these conditionally rendered modals. And so this should say this is a test. And we pop this open, and cool, right? We've got the beginnings of a modal. We want this positioned correctly in the middle of our screen. So we're going to put display flex on its container, justify content center, align items center. Right? There we go. Now it's in the middle. We're getting an overflow. Don't know why that's happening, but that is fine. We won't worry about that right now. Let's just try box sizing border box, which is the first thing I always try when I'm getting an overflow. Okay, well we'll revisit that later. For this, let's set a padding of 1 rem, and essentially we have 2 cases of modal, right? How do we handle contents that overflow inside of our modal? In other words, how does our modal scroll? You have 2 main kinds. One, the modal goes off the screen, and you scroll the screen, and then you see the bottom part of the modal, or the interior of the modal scrolls. Now, I don't like either of these. I think it's really bad UX to have a modal that can't fit on one screen. I think it should probably be something other than a modal. But it's going to happen, and we want to program defensively around it. It's easier CSS-wise to do the scroll inside, and we can just do this with some like max heights. I can say this has a max height of 80 VH. So this can only take up 80% of the vertical height of the screen, and then overflow auto. So if the contents overflow, now the interior will scroll. And that's fine. We can do the same thing with width. I meant to type 80, but 90 is fine as well. So that way we get, we make sure that the modal is never going to spill off the sides of our screen, which is good. Okay. All right, so there's our modal. Man, why? Why are you doing that? Well, we'll see if portals fix it. This is another reason why this might be bad, is this might be inheriting some CSS that we do not anticipate, when it really should be not doing that, because we don't want it rendered as a child of this. So any questions with that CSS, with our basics of absolute positioning? All right, cool. So we've got that going. I'm going to refresh this to clear our state to get rid of that modal. And now I'm going to click to open this modal. And we see this bottom part gets a little bit darker, but we don't actually see the contents of our modal. And that's because we're rendering it as a child right here of this sticky footer. And it's getting cut off due to the overflow hidden and due to some absolute positioning stuff. It's just not working well. And we can double check. We can open the DevTools on our browser, which I'm amazed we're not open already. Let's dock this to the right. All right. And so we can check and see. And indeed, here is our modal container, right, that is stuck inside of this, this sticky footer, which is bad. So portals to the rescue. What portals allow us to do is they allow us to take some children, right, and this should have curly braces around it, and instead of rendering them here in the React tree, we can put them inside another DOM node. And that's because the React tree is not equal to the DOM. We're going to see what that means in practice, but we already know that the React tree is different than the DOM because we have things like this fragment, which lets us group together DOM elements, even though this is not a thing in HTML land. Right? We already have some subtle differences bleeding in between our React JSX DOM and the real DOM. So the way that the portals work, and honestly, I would recommend you read the React docs on this, despite me explaining everything perfectly, is the way that this works is we specify a portal root, and that's going to be a div or something somewhere in the DOM where we want to add our children. We also have to wrap these children inside of another div, because what React is going to do is just replace the children of the target div with our children, and then put our target div inside of the portal root. So what I want to happen, right? What I want is, looking at this DOM, right? We have this div root, and I forgot to take it out when preparing this project, but what I essentially want is another div called portal root, and I want this to have an even more subservient div inside of it that is our modal. Right, I want something like this. I want something like this. And so the way this works in portal land, this is our portal root, aptly named, and then this is our target, and then inside of here is whatever children that we want to place inside of this portal. So the way we do this is we need to get a reference to a DOM node, and that's going to be our portal root. And this is our exploration into actually interacting with the DOM with React. We can do this dynamically. You could, at runtime, create a portal root and then use that. I'm not going to do that here. One, because that's important for libraries, right? You can't, in your library instructions, say, edit your index.html. No one's going to use your library. Right? You want them to just render some React stuff and have that work. I'm going to leave that as a challenge up to you all. I have always found it sufficient, since I am generally not writing library code, to just go ahead and edit my index.html, because I don't need to worry about it. So I've already put inside here this div with an ID of portal root. So that's what we're going to use as our portal root. We can just do a normal document.query selector for hash portal root, right? And that is going to get us our portal root. This is totally fine. Because this is static, I don't have to do this inside of this component. This is always going to be the same reference. Bad things would happen if it got deleted out of our DOM. We're just going to assume that won't happen. However, TypeScript has our back. If you look at the message in the bottom left corner of the screen, notice that portal root's type is element or null. Technically, this query selector could fail, and it will fail if someone were to remove portal root from the index.html. I'm just going to assume that won't happen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to put an exclamation point right after the value here. And what that is saying to TypeScript is, you know what, I understand that you are correctly intuiting that this value could be null or undefined. However, it is defined. And now if we look at that message window, we'll see that it just has the type of element. So I'm just always going to assume that this exists. And that's what that exclamation point means. Okay. So now that we have our portal root, let's take a look at this documentation. What we need to do is we need to render, instead of JSX, a function react-dom.createPortal. The first argument is going to be the React elements that we want to render, which generally is going to be the children of whatever component is wrapping this portal, in our case, capital P portal. And then the second argument is the DOM node that we want the children to be inserted into. This is not our portal root, because if we were to render multiple modals, they would overwrite each other, because React is just going to chuck the existing children of that DOM node out and put ours in. So we need to create a burner div, a container div, to hold the children of this specific React element, and then put that inside of our portal root. And there's lots of ways to do this. This is class-based code. This is not hook-based. This is not functional component-based. So we're going to convert that roughly into the functional style. But the spirit is essentially the same. What we need to do is, when this component is first rendered, we need to create a div with good old document.createElement. Right? When this component is mounted, I'm going to need to create a div. And then, when this component is mounted, I want to put that div inside of my portal root. Then finally, I can render the portal with the children that I want to be inside of my target. Tricky bit is on unmount. When I unmount this component, we can do that and nothing catastrophic will happen, but we want to clean up this old div that we have. Otherwise, it's just going to stick around and start polluting our DOM, and that's going to be a memory leak. Right? If we keep rendering and unrendering the modals, we're going to get more div at the top of our DOM, which is bad. And eventually, if someone did it enough, could crash the tab, because we've created 10 billion divs, and even Chrome cannot eat that much memory. So we want to clean up. We want to clean up the reference to this div, which we'll do inside of a useEffect cleanup function. I know I'm spoiling stuff a little bit. We do have a little bit of an issue translating this code over, because they do something inside the constructor. Right? So when this component is mounted, this constructor is going to be run, and that's when they create this div, our target element, and we can't do that inside of a functional component. Since we want to do this on mount, we could do this inside of a useEffect. We can do something like target. I'm going to call this target LM. We could do this inside of a useEffect. Initially, this is going to be null, and then we can do useEffect on mount. Right? We can set target LM to be document.createElement div. All right, we can do this. However, This is going to mean its first go around target element is not going to be defined, so we can't actually get down to rendering portals, otherwise things will break. And this is also going to trigger another re-render. Instead, I'm going to show you a hack. I'm not going to call it a trick. I'm not going to call it good, but I'm going to show you a hack, because what some of you might be thinking is that this code is equivalent, right? My left-hand side code is equivalent to my right-hand side code. This .l is equal to document.createElement div. Target element is equal to this useState where we make a div. However, this isn't equivalent. And does anyone know why? Not equivalent code. All right, what does this statement do? Document.createElement div. This creates a div. When does this code run? On every render. The constructor in the class-based code will only run once. This statement right here inside of the useState, it'll run on every render. Despite the fact that we only use it as the initial value, what we're going to be doing is creating extra divs on every render, and that's bad. So you might use the useEffect code. However, useState has a special mode called lazy initialization, where we can, instead of giving it a, I'll do this, instead of giving it a value, we give it a function. And React will only on mount, only when it needs to get the initial value of the useState, will it evaluate this function to get the value here. So now this document.createElement div will only run on the first render. That's a very neat trick. This is good to use when you have an expensive calculation to get initial state that you don't want to repeat over and over again. I'm calling this a hack here because we're doing this to encapsulate a side effect, and that's bad. It's bad because React would not be breaking its API by maybe sometimes accidentally running this callback more than once. So we shouldn't use it for this. However, I'm gonna, and you can't stop me. And that's the way it is. So that's a neat trick, lazy initialization. This will also make sure that the type of target element is always a div. We don't have to worry about it being null sometimes and yelling at TypeScript to be like, no, it's not null because it's the second render. I've made sure it exists. Now it just always exists. If we accidentally create some extra divs whose reference is going to go away later, that's fine. The garbage collector can deal with that. Okay. So we've got our target element. We've got our portal root. So what we're going to return is the React DOM dot create portal, right? Is that it? Yeah. So I'm going to import, I'm just going to import it directly, create portal from, oh, I already did that right here. Create portal from React DOM. And so instead of returning this, what we're going to do is create a portal. The elements we want to render are going to be the children of this portal component, and where we want them to be is inside of our target element, right? However, we have not mentioned our portal root, and that's our bad. That's our party foul. We need to create this target div and place it inside of the portal root. Now, I'm not going to go so far as doing that inside of this useState, because we're treading on very dangerous territory there. I also want to make use of a useEffect cleanup function, which is going to handle removing our target element from the portal root when this component is unmounted. So what I can do is I can say in a useEffect, on my first render, what I want to do is add to portal root what is this? Append child is what I want. I would use just append, which is the newer, cleaner API, but someone logged into my website a couple weeks ago on Internet Explorer 11, and it broke. So I'm going to use append child here because that made me sad. So I'm going to add our target element here. Then I'm going to make use of my cleanup function. If you're fuzzy on cleanup functions, you might want to revisit the project I did on timers, which makes use of them heavily. But essentially what this value is we can return inside of our callback to useEffect a function that will run whenever the useEffect runs again or the component unmounts. So when we no longer need this target element because we're no longer rendering our modal or whatever, we can go ahead and remove it from our portal route. Then none of our code is going to have a reference to target element anymore, and that is eventually going to get garbage collected by JavaScript, and we don't have to worry about this div appearing in our DOM or taking up memory anymore. Right. Okay. We're not done with this yet. A lot of subtle things here, but we're getting pretty close. So we've got this going on. Now I'm just going to wrap this inside of my portal component. That should be a capital P, portal. And let's see what happens. Boom, there we go. Still got our overflow. I actually wonder if I did this or not. Nope, those are the correct values. Okay. So we've got our portal, and this one is still working just fine. Let's refresh the page to clear our state. And then let's try this one. This one also works. And that's because if we look at our DOM tree inside of portal root, we indeed have our target element, which has our modal inside of it. And this is rendered not in the React tree. It is not there anymore. And if I look inside of my sticky footer, we only see our fake cookie warning that I wrote, which is very funny and you should all appreciate. We don't see a modal. And this is mind-blowing to me. I don't know if you fully captured how ridiculous and magnificent this feature is. But we can render things wherever we want, right? If we couldn't do this, this would make doing things like modals and toasts and whatnot so annoying. This is a beautiful, wondrous feature that React has given to us, and I'm so thankful for it every day. We have just rendered a React element somewhere else. Oh, I think that's awesome. I think that's such a cool thing. Couple things. Small thing is I forgot an arbitrarily large Z index on our modal container here. Let's do 300. Z index is the stacking order of things. So that sticky footer was above our transparent background. Now it's below because our Z index is higher. Don't have a great React solution to making sure all your Z indexes work. That's just the name of the CSS game.
Henry, quick question. I was actually just going to ask about that. So there's no like best practices as far as like giving your Z indexes certain values. It's just kind of like keep track of them yourself and hope it doesn't break.
There probably is. I don't know any. I am lucky enough to be working on a small enough system that I know all the Z indexes, and that's fine. One thing that some people don't know about Z indexes is that not all of them are equal. There's a thing, and I linked to it in here, called the stacking context, where Z indexes actually can exist inside of different places. So if you have an element with transform, with the CSS property transform set inside of it, that will create its own stacking context. So Z indexes inside of that element will stack relative to each other, but the outer container with transform set on it has its own Z-index value inside of the greater container that its children cannot change. So there are places where you can prevent certain Z indexes from jumping out of their container. And you'll sometimes see code. If you're looking through like libraries or production code or something, you'll see code like this. Transform rotate 0, which does nothing other than establish a stacking context. So you make sure there's no Z index container escapes.
Yeah, it's almost like the set timeout hack, where you're almost like deferring something to somewhere else.
Yes.
Just because the context of whatever's running in that somewhere else is different from your root application.
Exactly. This transform will also automatically make this position relative for, absolute positioning things. And this stuff can get complicated. As you can see, we have different stacking contexts here. This has a Z index of 1, this has a Z index of 2, but these are inside of different contexts. So we do different things, and that is its own nightmare. And again, don't have a great solution for it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. All right. Any other questions? I feel like we're good point for some questions. I did a lot of stuff. All right. So we've got that going, which is wonderful for us. We can now render things wherever we want and ignore the parents. I'm going to show you perhaps the coolest part of portals. All right. So, right in the DOM, we have a thing called event bubbling. Right. If I click on the word screen, an on-click event is going to fire for the div that contains the word screen, and then it's going to fire for the div that contains the modal contents, then it's going to fire for the div that contains the modal. And in, I'm kind of giving away the secret here, and in a normal DOM tree, what would happen, right, is if I clicked on the word screen, let's expand these. If I clicked on the word screen, on-click event would fire on this div, bubble to this div, bubble to this div, bubble to this div, bubble to the body. And that's great, except I, as a developer, I don't know that this modal has a portal somewhere else. And what I need to do is actually track some clicks on my sticky footer. Right? And in traditional DOM event bubbling, right, this would not fire if I clicked inside of my modal, because the modal is not inside of my footer div. Not there. However, right, so if I click here, let's get the console to show so we can see. Nope, this one. Yeah. All right, so when I click inside of here, right, we get this console logged event object. So I'm going to open the modal, and then I'm going to click on the word screen. Well, my face is actually covering it in the recording, but we've just seen another event get printed to the console. And another one, you can see the scroll bar, which, now I'm pointing to it. You can see the scroll bar getting smaller as more and more events get dispatched. And the magic behind this is that somehow React makes portal elements respect the intuitive DOM bubbling, right? The events still bubble within our React tree, right? Because modal is a child of this div, so click events bubble up, even though that's not how it is in the DOM. Ridiculous, right? This is not as simple as just slapping a div somewhere else. This is React truly being magical. So we can use these portals anywhere we want and not really mess up the developer expectation of how React stuff works and how events work. It just works so transparently, and that is brilliant. And the reason that this works is because React events are not DOM events. The React tree is not the DOM tree, and those events are also different. In React, we call these synthetic events. You can still get normal events, by adding event listeners onto actual DOM elements, but React does some cool, efficient things with its events, as well as doing absurd things like this, like making the portals still bubble events within the React tree, even though that's not how they are in the DOM. So it's very neat. All right. So there we go. That was just a quick aside there. We also don't need set target element here because we're just using our use state as a quick hack to do something once on the first render. Got our modal rendering. All right, cool. Technically, this should be inside this dependency array. God forbid if this target element changed, we would need to do this. However, it's not going to, so this is just good form. All right, so we've got that going. All right. Now I want to make these modals closable. All right, huge pet peeve of mine is I want to be able to click on this space and have it close the modal. Right. So to do this, we're going to need to pass a prop to our modals. I'm thinking on close. And in this case, right, what I want this to do is just set is normal open to be false. However, TypeScript, right? We're writing TypeScript. Did you all forget? Did you all forget this was TypeScript? Because I didn't, because it just yelled at me. I can't just give prompts to my React components. I have to write types for those props. So I'm going to create a type called modal props. And this is going to be an object. Delete that comment. And we're going to take a prop called onClose. And the type of this is going to be a function, which we write the type of by just writing an arrow function. What it returns, however, is nothing. Right? When we write our event handler functions, we never return things out of them because that doesn't mean anything. And we can make sure that the function doesn't do anything by using a special type value in TypeScript called void, which means nothing. Right? Doesn't mean null, doesn't mean undefined. It means nothing. You do not return anything. Right? And then so now, the type of my modal, the type annotation here after the colon, right now is react.function component. I can give as a generic type to react.function component the type of the props it should expect, and now I can use that. So now we have onClose, and I have to go ahead and add it here too, because that is a required prop. So this is going to be set is footer open. And these are bad variable names, but I don't get paid to write good variable names. I actually do. You all don't pay me to write good variable names. I should be more specific. Okay, and just because I did it out of habit here, in these type objects, we can end our entries with either a semicolon or a comma. Doesn't really matter which one. So now we can attach an onClick event listener here. Right, so when we click on this, I can just write onClose here. All right, so now when we click on the empty outside around our modal, it'll dismiss it. All right, so I can click here, then I can click out here. Perfect. It dismisses. I've made 0 programming mistakes. Nothing is wrong with this code. I click here, it dismisses. I'm even going to do a little bit of CSS. This is another thing that I'm constantly like, there's people out here slipping. I'm going to set the cursor to be a pointer, right? So now I get the little finger icon, and then inside of the modal, it's going to be auto. So now I get that nice implication that this is clickable, and this is whatever text or the normal thing or not, right? Perfect. Click there. Gorgeous. Except we just had a nice long conversation about event bubbling. So if I put an onClick event listener on this outer div, clicks inside of this div are going to bubble up and trigger it. So couple ways to handle this. One, onClick. e.prevent default. That is going to stop this from bubbling. There's also stop propagation. The prevent default also stops propagation of React. It doesn't do that for normal DOM events, which always kills me whenever I have to write normal JavaScript. But either work here. However, I don't like this. Right? In the same way, if I needed my event listener, up here, on this div, right, I would want to know about those click events. So I don't want to stop them from bubbling. Right? That's a last resort type of deal, is interfering with the referential transparency of that component. That's not a correct usage of that term, but we're going to keep moving. So instead, what we can do is we can just do a little bit of trickery. I'm going to write a handle container click function. And this is going to take an event, which I'm going to need to type. And this is going to be react.mouse event. And if you're wondering how I know the type of this event, this is why TypeScript is so kind. Because it's so good at inferring things, is that I can just start writing an event handler here and hover over this and see that the type of this event is react.mouse event. So cool. Handle container click. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to say if event dot, and notice we get this beautiful autocomplete, current target is equal to event.target. Now we're going to call onClose. So what this means, we have to reach back to our vanilla JavaScript knowledge. The current target of the event is the element that the event has bubbled up into. It's where the event is currently. And the target is where the event was actually triggered, what we actually clicked on. So I'm just making sure that the thing that was clicked on is indeed our container element. So now, click out here, closes, click in here, doesn't close, and we didn't have to stop event propagation. Now, some of you might think that this is kind of like trivia-y, or like, oh, okay, that's neat, best practices, whatnot. I'm going to tell you a quick story, which is I did the event.stopPropagation thing, and it cost me hours of debugging. So I had a modal, essentially, rendered very similar to this, did the stop propagation thing to make sure it wouldn't work. But then, for some reason, I had a form inside this modal, and when you hit enter inside of an input, it would not submit the form. And the reason it didn't submit the form is I didn't know this because browsers are ridiculous, is that the whole behavior of hit enter in the input and then that triggers a submit, and that only works when you have a input or button of type submit in the form. And the reason why that last part is necessary is because hitting enter in the input fires an onClick event on that button. And because I had e.prevent default for all onClick events, it would prevent the form from submitting. So really try to avoid doing stuff like that. It really reduces the composability of our React components and can make parts of our system interact with other parts that we did not intend to happen.
I have a quick question.
Yeah.
So I was building a dropdown for an application I was building, and I actually used refs to accomplish the same functionality.
Yes.
Would it be more idiomatic to use refs, or does it not really matter?
To be totally honest with you, this exact modal component exists in my code base at work, and I wrote it, and it uses refs. Yesterday when I was writing this code, I was like, wait, can I use current target? And it worked. So I was like, neat, I'll show them that.
Cool.
So refs still work, and we could absolutely do it that way for people that want to see it. But I just didn't use refs here because we can get away without it.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. Refs will also let us do slightly more complicated things if we really needed to. I want to jump back and talk about another kind of little bit of trivia that I think is really important, because this is a subtle but important React thing that is especially important to consider when we're rewriting class-based code into functional hook-based code. And that is useEffect versus component will mount. Not component did mount, but component will mount and use layout effect. So we could, look up one of the big, enormous flowcharts of the React rendering lifecycle, and it's kind of a nightmare, and no one remembers those. But in interviews, they'll be like, "Talk about the render cycle," and it's like, I don't know. Right, the way that this works when we're talking about function components is it's a little bit simpler. So whenever we re-render a function component, we just run the whole function. No lifecycle methods, right? It just runs, and the return value is put into the DOM. Right? Our code runs because it's in a function. However, our useEffect code runs after this function renders, right? So this useEffect code is going to happen after the first call to this function where we return this create portal. We don't need to talk about this yet. We can still talk about it. We can still talk about it here, and we'll talk about its relevancy. You know what? Actually, no. We're gonna go solve that right now, because otherwise, it's not gonna make visual sense. So here's a problem with modals. I know I'm jumping around. Is that I opened this modal, but I very purposefully made the height of this main element to be more than the screen, so it always scrolls. So right now, the page still scrolls, and this is terrible. And you might be able to fix this with a height 100% or whatever, but I don't want this to happen, right? We specifically chose this to be the kind of modal that scrolls inside, not scrolls outside. So I want to disable this from scrolling. So we're going to do this via some tricky DOM manipulation. And if you are like, how would I ever know to do this? The answer is Google it, because there's answers on the internet for how to do this. So what we want to do is when this component mounts, we're going to do some DOM manipulation. And specifically what I'm going to do is I'm going to say inside of a useEffect, for my document.body, I want to make it not scroll. And one way I can do that is by setting the position property to fixed. Right? And what this is going to do is it's going to say, hey, you're now stuck exactly where you are, which necessarily is going to make it unable to scroll. Position fixed elements don't scroll. They're just stuck where they are. So when I click this, right, our scroll bar on the side goes away, right, because it is now position fixed. Unfortunately, it is stuck like that. This is, again, a perfect use case for our cleanup functions. I can say when this component unmounts, I want to set this position back to the way it was. So I'm going to actually, we'll do it this way. We'll just unset it. All right, so now we've unset it. Cool. So now we have, whenever this modal opens, we set the body to be position fixed. That's going to make it unable to scroll, which is perfect because we don't want it to do that. And then when our component unmounts, we undo that. However, there's technically a tiny, imperceptible flicker of when this modal is visible and when the body can still scroll. And that's because the useEffect occurs after rendering. Right? So what will happen is we'll run this modal component and we'll return all of this good stuff. And then useEffect will run. But what's happening in between us returning this and the useEffect running is React actually painting the changes to the window. So what's going to happen is React gets the JSX back from this component. React evaluates that JSX and turns it into DOM elements. React reconciles those DOM elements against the one in the actual DOM. React makes the changes. And then we reach a decision point where we technically have a window to do some stuff before React gives the browser the go-ahead to show those changes to the user. And in a normal useEffect, our code does not run here because we don't want to delay showing things to the user. That's the whole reason these useEffects run after the render is we don't want them to hold up the render. They can happen later. It's fine. We want to get something in front of the user as soon as we can. So the useEffect will run after rendering and after painting these changes. However, sometimes we need to run code after the render and after the elements are in the DOM, but before the user gets to see them. And in a class-based component, this would happen with the component will mount lifecycle method, right? Will mount is opposed to did mount, right? Did mount happens after, will mount happens before. In hooks land, we have use layout effect, right? And what use layout effect does is it's exactly identical to useEffect, except it runs in that tiny window between DOM elements in the DOM, but user hasn't been shown them yet. We haven't painted. And so whenever we do this kind of DOM manipulation, we usually want to do it inside of a use layout effect. This is very important for things like controlling scroll position. If we were to scroll to a specific place here, in a normal useEffect, stuff would paint to the DOM, then the useEffect would run, the user would be at the top of the page, and then they'd flash down to where we scrolled them to in the useEffect. However, if we do that in the use layout effect, the stuff is going to paint to the DOM, we scroll, then the user gets to see what we've done starting at that scroll position. And it's the same thing here with this DOM manipulation. And some of you might be wondering, isn't this gross and non-reacty? Kind of. Do I care? No. Got to do what I got to do. We're in a browser. There's no great way to do this. There's libraries that will do this for you, and this is exactly what they do. However, we can make this better. Actually, stop there for a second. Does anyone have any questions about that? Use layout effect versus useEffect? Or beautiful life cycle? All right, cool. So we can make this a little bit better. One is if I were to render multiple modals, this would goof it up when the first one is dismissed because we're going from position fixed to now an unset position, which is going to mess up the scroll lock of the other modal. So instead, I want to preserve the value of position. Document.body.style.position to be what it is when this component mounts, and then I will set it back to that when the component unmounts. So that'll help with the multiple modal rendering. The other thing is, right, you'll see when I click on this that we actually scroll back to the top. And that's because the position fixed is putting this at 0, 0. And so this the body is automatically scrolling back to the top because the overflow just gets cut off. So we can fix that by doing some JavaScript. So I am going to capture the scroll position, which is window.scrollY. Can't forget our vanilla JavaScript DOM stuff. And this will be in pixels, the number of pixels that I've scrolled down. Right? We can check this in our console here, window.scrollY. Right now it's 237, and if I scroll to the top, it's 0. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to set the top of the document, document.body.style.top, to be a negative number of pixels equal to the scroll Y that I'm at. So scroll Y, pixels, there we go. And then I'm also going to preserve the top in the same manner, top, top, and then we'll reset it here, top, top. Right, so we open this. Oh no, I've broken something. Why did this break? This is not the thing I was expecting to break. All right, let's check this out. Why have you broken? Get out of here, console. This is always the best part of these videos, is me debugging unexpected CSS issues. It's because I'm doing this on body instead of root. I thought this was exactly how I did this. We're going to consult my practice code. I don't know if you guys knew that that branch is there, but you can see the exact code that I used to try and build these inside of the practice branch. App.tsx. No, I did it here too. And it definitely did not do that. Well, that is interesting to me. Huh. Ha ha ha. Why? Why is that doing that differently? This is a very interesting question for me to figure out live on camera. That's the exact same. Let's do something different here. Nope. Nope. Fascinating. Oh, it's because the modal also needs to be position fixed, not absolute. That's my bad. We don't want it to scroll anyway. So instead of this being position absolute, this is going to be position fixed. And that solves it. So now that it's just fixed at 0, 0, it's not going to be affected by the negative top value we're setting on the body, because that's just where it is. Whew. Oh, get so stressed when that happens. Okay, so now we've got most of the good stuff happening. When I open this modal, right, our background doesn't change position, but now when I close it, it's getting reset because we've set the top back to where it was. However, we're not actually preserving that scroll position. And as you saw in the background there, what I actually need to do is I need to set the scroll Y back to what it was. So we're going to do this by just doing a window.scroll_to. First value is X. It's the number of pixels in integer, and then the second value is where we want to scroll to. And this is why it's really important to do this inside of a useLayoutEffect, because otherwise we get that jumpiness of things being painted before stuff actually happens. And let's see if we'll get that effect here. I've lied to you slightly in the way that this works because, yeah, this is because of portal stuff. So it works just fine with useEffect and useLayoutEffect there, but that is that is not always true. Yeah, that's pretty cool. It's a pretty cool hook. Whenever we're writing hooks, always know you can do something like this, and then say const use scroll lock is equal to a function, and you paste the hook in there. Now you have a reusable hook. Look at that. Custom hook, hero, Henry Blevins. And so we'll just put that right here. Use scroll lock. All right, now we can put that inside of modals and side menus and whatever have you. So it's pretty cool. Any questions with that? Cool bit of DOM manipulation. Oh, cool. Now it broke. Why'd that break? Oh, gorgeous. Well, that's super interesting. Oh, it's because I have two of them. Oh my goodness, I didn't delete this one. Oh, my heart could not handle two of those events in one video. Yeah, so there we go. We've actually got another issue here, and that is when I open this modal, my scroll bar disappears, and that causes the width of my page to change, and that causes all the layout to change. It is possible to measure the width of that scroll bar and then add padding to the right-hand side of the body to account for it. And that is a thing that I have done, and it is not worth it. But it annoys me so much, and I cannot help but see it on every website that does this with their modals or slide-out menus, just that content reflow. Oh, it kills me. It drives me insane. So, yeah. Be hyper aware of how other people are writing this code. All right. I think that covers most of this that I wanted to talk about. I had some other stretch goals here inside of this project that I'd recommend some of you try and tackle. Right, we can turn our use portal, or sorry, our portal code into a custom hook, and you just copy and paste this into a hook, pretty much. Yep, dynamic route. We can do similar things with the document body to add event listeners for escape, which is cool. And you can do the whole target trick to make sure they're like not in an input or something, which is neat. Toasts as well. There's also this cryptic comment from the React documentation that I would encourage you to explore the meaning of. Any questions about anything we've done or any of these that you'd really like to see me do?
I mean, it's totally possible that you kind of covered this because I hopped in kind of late, but if you wouldn't mind me cheating on this homework and listening to your explanation, I would be interested to hear what, if you sort of rephrase that React documentation bit into layperson terms, I'd be interested to hear that.
Yeah. So it dovetails perfectly with our conversation about use layout effect and useEffect. Right? And that's why I started talking about that here instead of with the scroll lock stuff. Unfortunately, useEffect versus use layout effect is not relevant here, which is this useEffect runs after we've already rendered, right? So it's run after we've done create portal children target element. And what this is going to do is it's going to put our children inside of our target element, which is an unmounted div. Right, on the first render, we've created this div, and it doesn't exist within our DOM. It's just a div in memory. It isn't until this useEffect runs and that we append our target element to our portal root, does that actually exist inside of our DOM? And so for the first render, this isn't in the DOM, which is going to interfere with certain things. Autofocus is going to get messed up because that happens when the React component mounts, but it's not inside the DOM, so you can't focus it. And then it gets put inside the DOM on the next render after this useEffect runs. But by then it's too late for the autofocus to have had its effect. I forget, what's the other example that they have here? Yeah, measuring the DOM as well, right? You won't actually be able to calculate the height or width of this element on the first render because it's outside of the DOM. It's not affected by the CSS cascade, so you can't do that either. So what we can do to prevent that is just not render it on the first render. I can just have like a, const, first is equal to, use state true, and just delay actually returning anything until we've added this to the portal root. You can do other things by writing like imperative if statement based code directly in this function component. I don't recommend that. I think it's pretty bad to write side effects with if statements inside of function components, so I kind of hesitate to even bring it up. Although that's another method for getting this target element div created. I don't recommend it. Instead, I think we can afford the extra render and just delay that by a render until that actually gets put into our DOM. So, yeah.
Thank you.
Oh, you're welcome. You're welcome. This is why the React documentation is so good, is this kind of gotcha. It's very easy to leave out of documentation. And I really appreciate that they talk about it here. Because React, I love React. I love React to death. I find it so much fun to write React code, even when it frustrates me dearly with all of these tiny gotchas. And sometimes it feels like React is actually a library that someone else should use to write a really good framework. Because the developer experience can be a bit wonky, where it's like, no, it's not mounted in the DOM yet, so the portal doesn't work. But I absolutely think that their documentation makes up for a lot of that, because they spell so much of this stuff out for you. And you don't have to go track down Medium articles on like, why isn't the autofocus working in my portal? And I think that's great. Yeah. Anything else we want to talk about?
Do you have a non-calculating the width of the padding or the width of the scroll bar solution to stop that jumping?
No. As far as I understand, when I looked into it, that is it. That is the best you got. And that is what I do to solve this problem. The issue is that things like this sticky footer, which normally take up 100% of the width of the page, will then now have a little weird side divot. Henry pro tip hack is you can set a box shadow on them that is offset 0y and an arbitrary number of pixels to the right with the same background color, and no one will notice.
That's incredibly hacky and very amusing.
So we're going to go to meetmabel.com, which is a beautiful website that some incredible people have made. And then we're going to open this side menu. Right? No reflow in the background. No reflow, right? Right? We don't see a reflow, even though the scroll bar disappears. However, pay subtle attention. Oh, my computer's slowing down because I'm doing too many things, which is perfect. Pay subtle attention, right? This has a box shadow underneath it, right? When we open this and close it, we can see that box shadow doesn't quite make it all the way to the right edge. But we don't see a hard line here where the header gets cut off, and we would see like the right-hand side of that box shadow, and that's because it has a white extra box shadow just extending out to infinity. So yeah, I think that's the best way to do it. I believe there is a library someone wrote. Yeah, use scroll lock, which is why that name popped into my head. That will do this for you. I'm not sure if it does the padding trick or not already. Yeah, this is stuff. I guess the last thing I would have to say is that not all of this is production ready code. I don't always write production ready code here, and I think that that's fine. There are lots of gotchas. For example, and this will be the death of me. And this isn't the start of stuff you start noticing until you write production code and start testing and doing QA, is that height, 100 viewport height, right? That is the height of the viewport of the window on all modern browsers, except iOS Safari. iOS Safari will lie about the value of 100 VH to avoid extra browser re-renders, because it does fancy things with like popping up that bar on the bottom or the thing on the top. It won't actually report the fact that the visible height has changed now that those elements are present. So if you use 100 VH and you have an important thing at the bottom of the screen, that will get covered up when someone tries to touch it, because now the bottom bar pops up because iOS is being helpful, but it doesn't repaint the browser. And so instead of doing this, you might have to use some library that accounts for that. Same thing with position fixed. I believe iOS Safari will also ignore that on the body and scroll it anyway. So there are libraries that use special JavaScript stuff to get around that. However, the solutions that they come up with are very similar to a lot of the things we see here. And this is also perfectly fine code. Screw iOS Safari. No one uses iPhones anyway. And understanding how this partial solution works is great in a lot of ways, because if we go and look at the code for use scroll lock, we're going to see it does very similar things to what we've done. And this enables us to investigate our dependencies. And this enables us to understand library code. And this might not even be the library that I'm thinking of, because this is a very short file. Disable scroll lock is just in a different file somewhere. Where did you define
React scroll
this?
lock? I've used React scroll
Oh
lock.
yeah, it's use scroll lock is just the hook that wraps it. Scroll lock, React. Yeah. That's not it. Yeah, this one. Yeah, and so this is the big, standard library, solves this problem good. But if we look in here, we're gonna start seeing code that we recognize, doing DOM manipulation and measuring things. And this is why it's important to dig into React internals that we might not necessarily use. Like portals, we might just download a React host library, but if we're having issues with that, it's important that we know how to use this. And it's important if we want to contribute to that or start writing our own things. So partial solutions are great for learning. So, yeah. All right, well, I think I'm going to stop the recording there. Thank you, everyone, for watching this on YouTube. I'll see you later.